Ladies and gentlemen, a good evening and a very warm welcome to this evening's event at the Centre for Independent Studies. Could I just ask you to take a moment, please, to check that your mobile phone or smartphone device is switched to silent mode or vibrate mode. The event this evening is being recorded, and so if you want to ask a question, you will be recorded and for posterity. So if you don't want to be recorded, if you don't want your image reproduced or your voice reproduced, say nothing. And it's a particular pleasure to welcome to our two speakers this evening, Andrew Leigh and Tommy Tudorhope, who are joining us to discuss politics and social media and to consider whether or not there is a new spin. Well, before he was elected as the federal member for Fraser in 2010, Andrew was a professor of economics at the Australian National University. He was educated at the University of Sydney and at Harvard, and worked for a time as a lawyer and as an associate to former High Court Justice Michael Kirby. He was also principal advisor to the Australian Treasury. Andrew has written extensively on issues such as education, taxation and social policy, and appears frequently in the columns of Australian newspapers. Tommy Tudorhope is a prominent Australian social media expert. After pioneering the use of social media and online activism in Australian politics with Malcolm Turnbull, he went on to work at Sky News and at social media advisory firm SR7. He now runs his own social media consultancy. Tommy has been widely published on issues such as online piracy, cyberbullying and media in the digital age. He appears on TV regularly as a commentator on a variety of issues, including social networking, politics and the media, and makes regular contributions to opinion sites such as The Drum and The Punch. Well, the McKinsey Global Institute published a report recently in which, speaking about companies, it said that failing to communicate with customers on social networks could be as damaging to companies as not answering phone calls or emails. I wonder if that applies as much to non-company organisations. Notwithstanding the plunge in the value of Facebook shares, social media applications such as Facebook and Twitter have had a significant impact on the way that information flows and that social relationships flourish or wither, and that careers are built. What about its impact on politics? In a recent speech in Canberra, Andrew Leigh thought that technological changes in media have actually led to greater inequality in political information than ever before. So, what's going on? Our two speakers will help us figure it out. Will you please welcome Andrew Leigh and Tommy Tudorhope.
Well, we've tossed a coin and it's been decided that I would open the batting. And let me say that it's a real treat to be here tonight, speaking at the CIS on the important challenges that are afoot in the digital age, thinking about how we react to a new media and what we do. The CIS has been a great contributor to the big ideas debate in Australia, and I'd like to very much thank Greg not only for inviting me here tonight, but also for all that you've done, Greg, over the years to contribute to a serious ideas debate in Australia. And I'd, of course, like to acknowledge at the outset that we're meeting on traditional lands of the Indigenous owners and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. At the end of 1992, a team of us got together at Sydney University to run for the student newspaper, On y Soir. We needed a name with a hint of journalistic credibility and a bucket load of electoral appeal, so we went for the name The Naked Truth. We threw ourselves into the campaign with the kind of frisky eagerness that only a dozen 20-year-olds can muster. By day, we sang our Naked Truth campaign song to bemused lecture halls, by removing parts of our clothing to reinforce the team name. By night we put up posters and chalked The Naked Truth around campus, wishing as we did so that we'd chosen a shorter name. A room full of medical students promised to vote for us en bloc if a member of the team would streak naked through their lecture hall. One of us obliged. And so my year as a journalist began. I interviewed Andrew Denton, Henry Zepps, Dorothy McRae McMahon. I went inside Long Bay Jail and inside a submarine, spoke to a magician, a monk, a basketball commentator, and wrote about biblical literalism and virtual reality machines. I even reviewed half a dozen sports cars, making me, I hope, the only motoring writer in the whole history of student journalism. And I love journalism, but even at the level of student journalism, I found it hard. Pitching stories, separating beef from bulldust, staying objective. Since I spent that year as a student journalist, I would have written hundreds of thousands of words in newspapers, but all of them opinion, not journalism. And because of that, I approached the topic of journalism with a modicum of trepidation. Plus, because I'm a politician, you should probably regard my views on the media as akin to the views that a kangaroo has about gun ownership. But the first thing to say is that journalism really can change the world. Émile Zola's Jacques Hughes letter did more than win Dreyfus's freedom. It changed fundamentally the political character of modern France. Reporting by the Courier Mail and the Four Corners programme brought down the Bjelke-Petersen government, led to the jailing of 3 ministers. In 2005, a newspaper article brought down New South Wales opposition leader John Brogden, and I think probably changed the outcome of the 2007 New South Wales election. Looking across the profession as a whole, I would happily put Australia's best journalists up against the best in the world. So what I'm going to argue today is not, for the most part, going to be about individuals. Sure, I wish there were more great journalists and fewer crummy ones. And I'm sure most journalists would say the same about my profession. But frankly, there's not much point in politicians and journalists engaging in a name-calling exercise. In Roy Morgan's latest poll, the share of Australians that rate either politicians or journalists as highly ethical or honest has fallen to 1 in 10. So we need to start thinking systematically. And as someone who's trained as an economist, that's my natural inclination. Human agency can be important, but pivotal changes are normally the result of technology and policy, not individual actions. People respond to incentives, so if you want better behaviour, then changing the incentives normally works better than moral exhortation. And the big technological shift underpinning everything we're speaking about today has been the falling cost of disseminating ideas. Cable, digital TV have expanded the number of channels. Digital radio is about to have the same impact on that medium. Ubiquitous broadband has allowed news to be conveyed through a host of electronic media. So the effect of this, economically, has been increased competition in the media market. And by international standards, the Australian media, particularly the Australian newspapers, have not been particularly competitive. So this technological change has come as a massive shock to the incumbent players in the Australian media market. One of the places you see the impact of competition is that contest between outlets to be first with a story. As they say, Treasurer Keating in the 1980s would spend a month doing his budget roadshow. When he first came into office, Treasurer Costello would take a fortnight. By the time he left office, he'd be taking a week, and that's about where the budget roadshow is today. So my central thesis, as Peter has flagged to you, is that technological changes in the media have led to greater inequality in political information than ever before. For engaged citizens, there's never been a better time to be a news consumer. You can watch your press conferences live on Sky and ABC 24, get transcripts of radio programs in different cities. You can access the opinions of thoughtful bloggers and sassy tweeters, as I'm sure you're doing even as I speak. Engaged citizens are now better informed about political news than at any other time in our history. But then there's the remainder of the population. Some who are too busy with family and community to bother with national politics. Others who are more interested in the views of Lara Bingle than Laura Tingle. Those who don't seek out political information but let it come to them. And I believe that changes in the media are one of the factors that are making this group of Australians more disconnected from politics. In effect, technology has widened the information gap between the most informed and the least informed members of society. That notion, the one that technology can have a differential impact across society, is a pretty familiar one to economists. We use the term skill-biased technological change to capture the notion that some technological innovations both help high-skilled workers and hurt low-skilled workers. So, for example, while computerisation was making lawyers more efficient, it was making their typists redundant. And the thing about skill-biased technological change, about technology driving inequality, is if you're in the group that benefits, you can often not see the full picture. My guess is that many of you in the room are going to be engaged news consumers who most keenly feel the upside, the wealth of new information now at your fingertips. But it's important as policymakers and people involved in the policy debate to think about the whole impact across society if we want to get a full picture of how the media has changed people's views of politics. From the perspective of the most engaged citizens, the media is now more abundant, diverse and accessible than in the past. But that's not how things look to many Australians. Taken as a whole, the media has become more opinionated, narrower and shallower than ever before. Now that shift hasn't taken place because individual journalists have grown horn and forked tongues, but because the technological changes have privileged those kinds of voices. There's always been opinion, nastiness, shallowness in the Australian public debate. The thing is, they've now flourished over recent decades due to the technology. So let's start with opinion. Most of the new political websites that have emerged over recent years, whether they're The Drum, Online Opinion, Australian Policy Online, are dominated by comment. On television, Sky and ABC 24 thrive on commentary. Former Kevin Rudd Press Secretary Lachlan Harris puts it neatly when he says every year the number of journalists goes down, the number of commentators goes up. The economics of that is straightforward. As the environment becomes more competitive, you think about the fact that journalism costs money and comment is often free. And in the process, I think we're starting to devalue good reporting. Recently, Yale University journalism students were asked how they would have gone about investigating Watergate. And to the shock of their guest speaker, Bob Woodward, they essentially said, most of them, that they would Google Nixon's secret fund and the answer would pop out. Now looking to Australia, I must have read 100 comment pieces on the politics and the polling of asylum seekers. But I don't remember a single journalist having asked a Malaysian government official, why haven't you signed the Refugee Convention? And again, this comes down to information inequality. The engaged news consumers see opinion as just adding to their smorgasbord. But disengaged news consumers are increasingly getting fewer facts and more commentary. Now, my concern about comment isn't primarily about ideological bias. I'm going to give you a revelation. I don't think the Labor Party is having a dream run in the mainstream press at the moment. But I know enough history to know that the worm turns. Curtin wins a landslide in 1943 with Packer and Murdoch against him. In the early 80s, Hawke has much of the mainstream media on his side. 2003, it's Howard Government Minister Richard Alston who files a dossier of 68 complaints against the ABC for perceived bias in their reporting of the Iraq War. So politicians of all stripes have complained about the media. When I sat down with Joshua Gans to do our own systematic study of media slant, the period 96 to 2004, our answer was that most outlets had centrist positions. So my main concern about the rise of opinion is the risk that it leads to a more polarised electorate. A lovely experiment done by Stanford's Jeffrey Cohen asks students to rate a hypothetical social welfare program. And the students get an article that describes the program and which states whether Republican or Democratic leaders supported it. And the result is that what matters is not the welfare program itself, it's party leaders' views. So if their party endorsed it, Democrats would support a harsh welfare program. Republicans would support even a lavish one. My real fear here is that the rise of opinion threatens the information commons. It threatens to split people into increasingly extreme echo chambers. The second trend that concerns me is nastiness. In her address to another Sydney think tank last year, Annabel Crabb argued that there's a hostile, scratchy field of politics at the moment. In the latest quarterly essay, Laura Tingle contends that Australia's politics and their public discourse have become noticeably angrier. Now, there's always been people saying ungenerous things about politicians. Very often, those people are other politicians themselves. But there's two features of the technological shift that I think have accentuated the nastiness in political reporting. The first is competition from online outlets. The second is the shield of anonymity. And the impact of competition is to reduce the time outlets have to do their fact-checking. So when tabloid papers published on their front page fake nude photographs of Pauline Hanson, they did so partly out of a concern that if they didn't act in haste, then they'd be scooped by an online site. Competition from online outlets encourages outlets to exaggerate or simplify. When deadlines are tight, competition is fierce, you can see how journalists end up cutting corners. Oft-reported errors include the claim that opposition leader Tony Abbott's reaction to the death of an Australian soldier was "shit happens," whereas in fact Abbott was summarising another soldier's view, or the oft-reported claim that Australia has an economy-wide carbon price, where in fact our carbon price covers about 60% of domestic emissions. Another way that technology accentuates nastiness is through the anonymity of website comments, blogs, tweets. And if you've ever said something nasty or on social media or over email, then you'd say in person. You know how it can happen. Even text messages provide a shield behind which poison darts can be hurled. George Megalogenis notes how 2GB's Alan Jones read out text messages before the Cronulla riots, such as this one. This Sunday, every Aussie in the Shire get down to North Cronulla to support Leb and Wog Bashing Day. As Megalogenis argues, the common sense filters that we use to keep the letters to the editor page civil, prevent the cranks from getting on air, don't apply in cyberspace, because the medium rewards those who generate the most outrage. There's even an academic study that found that individuals are more likely to be persuaded by political arguments that play on their fears, and that's true even when they're told counter-arguments. Again, this is a case of information inequality. If genteel discussion is your thing, you've now got instant access to every Productivity Commission report and thoughtful sites like The Conversation. But if you're a disengaged news consumer, then the public debate has become noticeably scratchier. My third concern is that the new media technologies are driving towards a shallower national conversation than in the past. One manifestation of this is the rise of the showman politician, known more for exaggerations and snappy grabs than their thoughtfulness. When I was waiting one day at the doors of Parliament House to speak to reporters, it occurred to me that the 24/7 news cycle has about the same effect as if we offered a cash prize every day to the politician who could come up with the most outrageous line. Another aspect of shallowness is the emphasis on gotcha questions. Will you rule out? Will it increase? Do you promise never to? And shallowness also manifests in picking examples that aren't representative of the broader context. The current inflation rate's 1.2%. It's the lowest in a decade. But you can always run a cost of living story by finding individual items whose price is rising, individual households whose costs have gone up. And similarly, the current unemployment rate of 5.2% is low compared to recent decades. But if you want to write about job losses, you'll always be able to find examples. On the average working hour of the average working day, about 1,530 Australians lose their job, and about 1,550 Australians find a new one. Every working hour, every working day. Another feature of political journalism that's become increasingly ubiquitous is the focus on the horse race element of politics through the lens of opinion polls. As technology has reduced the cost of carrying out opinion polls, their frequency's increased. And the problem is that polls are notoriously inaccurate. Across major pollsters over the last 2 decades, the average election eve poll mispredicts the result of the election by 1.8 percentage points. Murray Goot notes the following. If an enterprising rogue had set up a pseudo-poll that conducts no interviews but simply works on the assumption that at every election Labor would get 50% of the two-party preferred vote, he or she would have gotten an average error of, wait for it, 1.8 percentage points. And of course, if you're doing polls earlier than election eve, your errors are larger still. Superficiality isn't something that's emerged in the last decade or so, but it does pose a particular challenge for reforms that aren't intuitive. The arguments in favour of free trade, foreign investment, a floating dollar, a goods and services tax and a price on carbon are all more subtle than the arguments against them. I think too, for politicians, the technological changes in the media have made reflection, doubt, subtlety more difficult than in the past. One of the major drivers of the move towards shallowness is the rise of television, the decline of newspapers. Television news bulletins tend to provide less depth than newspaper reports. So for the most engaged, the conversation might have become deeper and richer, but for disengaged citizens, the trend's been in the opposite direction. So what should we do about it? For the perspective of regulation, the Finkelstein report that the government's currently considering makes the point that when technology changes, legal regimes need to adapt. Take, for example, smh.com.au and msn.com.au, 2 of the most popular news websites in Australia. Content at the moment on the Sydney Morning Herald website's created by a newspaper, which operates under a voluntary code of conduct regulated by the Australian Press Council. Content on the 9 MSN websites largely created by a broadcaster, with complaints directed to a statutory authority which may consider the suitability of a person who seeks to hold a broadcasting licence. A newspaper proprietor, by contrast, is not subject to such a test. So I think if we were starting from scratch today, it's much more likely we would have come up with something like Finkelstein's proposed News Media Council than it is that we would have devised the current regime. But the argument I want to make is that complaints handling bodies are only a part of the challenge, and really I think the more significant problem is sustaining the economics of quality journalism. One proposal that's been put forward both by Lindsay Tanner and Malcolm Turnbull is to provide subsidies to quality newspapers. Tanner proposes direct grants. Turnbull suggests providing tax-deductible gift recipient status to newspapers that subscribe to a code of conduct analogous perhaps to that subscribed to by the ABC. Now naturally, I'm sure as Malcolm himself would say, such a proposal would have to pass a cost-benefit test. But you can imagine that the benefit of a better informed public might well justify the subsidies. And I think in implementing such a proposal, it would be important to make sure that public money increased the amount of political information available to those who are disengaged from politics. If you accept my thesis that the problem is information inequality, then we don't want to start subsidising content consumed only by those who are the most engaged. As an economist, I'm naturally drawn to using price signals rather than regulation to achieve a given aim. It's particularly the case where there's considerable controversy over defining what we mean by quality journalism. I don't think we can define good journalism any more than you can legislate good taste. Legislate good journalism any more than you can legislate good taste. But appropriate subsidies might be able to get us there. And lastly, there's the question as to how reforming politicians should behave in a changing media environment. I don't think the changes afoot are ideologically neutral. I do think that they're particularly beneficial for populists and libertarians. I think they're particularly confronting for long-game reformers. And in this, I'd include some of the reforms championed by the CIS over many years, including civility, teacher equality, tax reform, and Indigenous affairs. I haven't always agreed with the position the CIS has taken, but I do realise that you here at the CIS are more concerned with engaging in the battle of big ideas than thinking up the next snappy one-liner or demonising your opponents. A decade ago, when I came to ask Greg's advice on setting up a left-wing think tank, one of those projects that never came to pass, he was generous with his time and his advice. You're here tonight because you're interested in big ideas. So for those of us who believe in big picture reform, it's vital we continue to talk about big ideas. Critical reforms like Medicare, universal superannuation, HECS and the GST didn't happen by themselves. They were the product of passionate and painstaking advocacy. And I think we need to get better at linking the reforms of today with the events of the past. Too much reliance on talking points and lines can win the battle but lose the war. Humans are fundamentally storytelling creatures, and stories are a powerful way of persuading people about the importance of change. Reform isn't about uprooting our history, it's about allowing our values to endure in a changing world. Reform to me is about identifying those golden threads that run through our history. So I've said a lot tonight that's pessimistic, but I think there's good reason to be optimistic. We can't return to those old ways of doing things. We all need to learn to manoeuvre our way in the new environment. The Fourth Estate's going through perhaps the biggest transformation of the past century. For highly engaged consumers, there's never been a better time to be a news junkie. And here's hoping we can eventually say the same for the rest of the population. Thanks very much.